It's appropriate where I live in British Columbia in Canada to thank the owners of the land. So I would like to thank the Maori people for welcoming me and allowing me to be in this very, very beautiful place. I also want to thank the University of Auckland, or Auckland University. Right, okay. For inviting me to be here, and particularly to Mark and Maria, who have organized this talk. And it's just wonderful to be in New Zealand, to have a very beautiful country. So I'm going to read my paper today, and this is a paper that I wrote and is going to be published in the Environmental Humanities Journal. And part of the paper will also be co-written with, not what I'm going to present today, but parts of what I'm going to present are going to be revised on a paper that a book that I'm writing with Africa Taylor on children and animals. And I don't think that you have raccoons here, but we are thinking about pairing raccoons with possums. And you'll probably, as I talk, you'll probably understand why we're doing that pairing. And the paper has 3 parts, and I'll tell you a little bit more in a few minutes as to what the different parts are. But it also has 2 different voices, and one are narratives, and it's very easy to see the difference between the narratives and my commentaries when you see it visually. So what I'm going to do is tell you that I'm going to tell a story, so you don't, you know why I'm changing voices. And I'm going to start with a story. And as you saw, the title of the presentation also changed, because since I sent the title to Mark maybe a month ago. Starting with the story. At the childcare center located in a mountain forest on Canada's west coast, an educator checks the playground for raccoons. The animals are one of several species indigenous to this forest, which is the setting of one of the country's major universities. As the university has grown, an ever-expanding network of high-rise condominiums, retail outlets, fast food restaurants, parking lots, and this childcare center complex has been built alongside it, with each expansion encroaching on the raccoon's habitat. And when I say complex, this is the childcare center that has 9 different centers, and the centers are one besides each other, and they're separated by, the playgrounds are separated by a fence. On this particular morning, the educator scours the playground looking for any raccoons that might be hiding in the trees, in the playhouse, under the slides, in the sandbox, or in the children's garden. She approaches the shed that holds the children's bikes and scooters. Opening the door, she startles a mother raccoon and her calves, who are sleeping inside. Startled herself, the educator jumps and stares wide-eyed as 3 pairs of eyes glare back at her. She slams the door and decides on the spot that the children will not ride the bikes and scooters that morning. Now she faces a dilemma. The children are required by law to spend time outdoors at least twice a day, rain or shine, and she will need to get the riding toys out of the shed by the afternoon. How will she coax the mother raccoon and her babies out of the shed when she is clearly more afraid of the raccoons than they are of her? Raccoons, children, and educators co-inhabit this colonized space on unceded Coast Salish territory. Raccoons lived here for hundreds of years before the university and childcare complex were built. Not only have raccoons adapted to the presence of humans in their habitat, they are active participants in the life of the childcare centers. The fence that was constructed around the centers to keep the raccoons out and the children safe instead offers raccoons a means to move in and out of the forest and from center to center. For the last 6 years, the playgrounds in this complex have been the permanent home of several raccoon families that have both entertained and troubled the children and educators. So in this paper, I'm going to trace and story the actual, the messy, the unequal, and imperfect worlds that raccoons, educators, and children inherit and co-inhabit along with other human and non-human beings and entities in this mountain forest. This entangled world is replete with charm, with curiosity, and uneasy, asymmetrical, and tenuous relations. The correlatings of these co-inhabitants are particularly fraught with frictions around the human binaries that separate nature from culture. I said humans, not animals, but human binaries. Day after day, at these childcare centers, raccoons cross boundaries. And day after day, educators diligently labor to keep the boundaries intact and teach children to enact them. Now I'm going to be drawing on a multi-species ethnography that I'm doing in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and in Victoria. This particularly is in Vancouver. And the paper has, as I told you, 3 parts. In one part, I'm going to talk about the binaries that the raccoons cross, and in 3 different ways, and then how the educators attempt to maintain those boundaries. And then at the end, I'm going to end the paper concludes by emphasizing the impossibility of maintaining these boundaries between nature and culture. But before I do that, I'm going to provide a brief discussion of how the nature-culture divide that is enacted in the childcare centers is inextricably linked to today's pressing colonialist and environmental challenges. So the nature-culture divide that the raccoons constantly cross in the childcare centers is the human side of inherited histories in this mountain forest. Environmental philosophers highlight that this divide is the root of anthropogenic environmental damage to the planet in current times, which a growing number of scientists now refer to as the Anthropocene. The mistaken Euro-Western Enlightenment belief that humans are somehow exceptional to and hyper-separated from nature and can modify, can improve, or exploit the environment with impunity is foundational to modernist Europe, where the concept of nature emerged as both an object of scientific inquiry and as a resource for economic progress. When capitalism emerged following the Enlightenment, not only did the idea of nature as a resource for human society became increasingly normalized, but this idea also drove the colonization of the Americas by Europeans. The presence of raccoons in the childcare centers is closely related with environmental damages that we continue to accrue. While urbanization, climate change, and other devastating human actions in the Anthropocene have eliminated several species and threatened many more, some species, including raccoons, have thrived, as you can see here. As urban adapters, raccoons are one of the most efficient mesopredators at exploiting anthropogenic resources. Despite extensive pelt trading, being hunted for meat, being killed by farmers for attacks on their crops and poultry, and serving as a popular pet during the early colonial period, raccoon populations have escalated, spurred by the animals' adaptability to living alongside humans. Indeed, they are so adaptable that in a documentary in the series The Nature of Things, host David Suzuki asks whether in cohabiting with raccoons, we are actually, and I quote, pushing their brain development and perhaps even sending them down a new evolutionary path. Yet, in North American cities, narratives abound of raccoons as invasive and feral species. Raccoons' intelligence has always been recognized in North American indigenous cosmologies that assume the inseparability of humans and non-humans. Many First Nations and Native American children's stories and creation stories feature the raccoon whose wily trickster ways enact teachings about respect, cooperation, honesty, hard work, and humans and animals as relations, as well as many other lessons about living well together with more than human others. These relations with raccoons and other non-human species are far from the hierarchical orderings of human culture and non-human nature that have always been the foundational justification for the domination of nature as a resource for human colonization and exploitation. In settler societies, such as Canada, the entwined cultural and environmental dimensions of colonization, which resulted in the indigenous dispossession and environmental destruction, are one of the many inheritances of the twin projects of imperialism and industrialization. Many scholars in the environmental and the indigenous humanities called for an end to this delusional separation between humans and the environment, or between nature and culture, urging us to refocus on the entanglement of human and more than human lives. So my inquiries today about the raccoons resonate with this environmental and indigenous humanities scholars' endeavors to find new ethical ways of living and relating in what we now call the Anthropocene. Specifically, I want to acknowledge in the paper that human and non-human histories and futures are inextricably intertwined, or the raccoon and the children and the educators' histories and futures are intertwined. So I'm going to pay attention to raccoon-child cohabitations precisely because raccoons in the child care centers confront humans with the impossibility of maintaining colonialist separations between human and wild animals. And raccoons do that through their unruly behaviors. As Leslie Innestone describes in discussing other wild urban species, raccoons are a sort of troublemaker who not only transgress the colonial separation of nature from culture, but also produce anxiety and panic in the highly regulated childcare spaces. The educators are confronted with nature cultures that confound human expectations and dominant norms of urban landscape appreciation. As raccoons respond to our human ways of living, not only do they interrupt the regulated childcare movements, they also force awkward encounters for educators by thwarting human efforts to maintain the divide. So they provoke the humans in the child care centers to become more aware of the world that they are part of. They demand from the educators And like other animals that live in the forest, like bears or deer, raccoons demand high levels of awareness of our own behaviors inside the child care center spaces. The raccoons who live in this complex cross nature, culture, and human, non-human boundaries in several interrelated ways, and there are 3 different ways. First, spatially, they cross the nature-culture divide by refusing to keep to themselves in the wild. They make incursions into human territories and are not deterred to remain in the right place in the wild. They enter the child care playgrounds, they barge into classrooms through the open doors and windows, and make dens in the center's storage sheds, like in the story that I told you at the beginning. And here is another story of the raccoons crossing the spatial divide. The mother raccoon climbs down from a tree with her 2 cubs. Crossing right through the sandbox, she enters a small tent in the playground, a favorite domestic play space for the children. The cubs follow. The raccoon family frolics in and around the children's tent, entertaining 5 children who watch with widened eyes and open mouths. The mother moves 2 red cushions from the tent as if rearranging the furniture. Immediately after her 2 youngsters sit on them, as charming homemakers, they appear to be extremely comfortable in this space. The mother places 1 more cushion beside the cubs for herself and watches as her youngsters playfully manipulate the plastic plates, cutlery, mugs, and other toy kitchenware the children had left in the tent. As this story also reveals, the human, non-human divide that the raccoons cross is not only spatially, but is also ontological, and this is the second one. Both their physical qualities and their behaviors are human-like. Their faces are uncannily human, with delineated eyebrows and mischievous expressions. Their paws have remarkable dexterity, which means they can open small containers, trash cans, and door latches, and even turn on water taps to have a drink. These playful, inquisitive animals delight and surprise both the children and the educators. Here is another story. With her 2 front paws, the mother raccoon picks up the bucket filled with water that the children left in the middle of the sandbox where they were building sandcastles. She carries the bucket to her cubs, who are waiting for her at the sandbox ledge. As soon as she puts the bucket on the ground, the 2 cubs dip their paws in the water and start splashing in the same way that children often do when they play with water. The mother raccoon watches the cubs as if she is supervising them. After a few seconds, the cubs shift to what seems like much more intentional actions. Using their front paws, they wash their faces. Captivated by the raccoon's human-like behaviors, a group of children and 2 educators watch this charming raccoon family through the classroom window. All of a sudden, the mother raccoon turns her head toward the window as if she is letting these curious humans know she is aware of them. Responding to this motion, one of the children places his hand on the window to gesture hello. The mother raccoon leaves her youngsters and approaches the window. Without hesitation, she raises her paw to meet the child's hand through the glass. Silently, the child and the raccoon gaze into each other's eyes. The other children and the educators look at each other with surprised expressions. No one moves until the raccoon walks away from the window and joins her youngsters. The children and the educators' curiosity about the raccoons, however, is tinged with disconcernment. Humans in the child care centers are taken aback by the raccoons' similarities to them. Recognizing themselves in these raccoons, they are attracted to them. This process is akin to what Levinas calls an ethics of recognition, where we see ourselves in the face of the other, and here non-human other, although Levinas doesn't talk about the non-human. However, the educators are also threatened by this raccoon's bold, wild nature, domesticated, urban, boundary-blurring behaviors. Even more provocative for humans is raccoons' naughtiness. They are tricksters and jokers who sabotage carefully planted garden boxes, vandalize trash cans, rearrange the playground, tap on the classroom skylights, as they're doing here, and play with the children's toys. These raccoons defy authority, resist human plans, ignore device, and deviate from the expected path. In other words, they live up to their reputation as masked bandits full of mischief. Another story. An educator enters the staff room. She is famished because it is almost noon and she took the first work shift. She places 4 plastic containers holding her lunch in a basket on the kitchen counter. Before she sits at the table to eat, she opens the fridge and takes out a cold drink. As she approaches the kitchen counter to retrieve her food, she finds a large raccoon grabbing one of her plastic containers from the basket. Before she has a chance to react, the raccoon carries the container out through the window onto the roof, rips it open, and with obvious enjoyment eats the sugary cereal that was packed inside. The educator quickly closes the window. Raccoons' unruliness, that is their refusal to maintain the human-non-human divide, has presented a challenge to settler humans since they arrived in North America. For instance, in the 18th century, scientists spent decades debating where to place the animal in the natural order. The raccoon's intelligence, curiosity, acute sense of touch, and mischievousness presented much taxonomic confusion as to whether the raccoon was a wild animal, vermin, or companion. In the early 1900s, as part of a wide cultural transformation around domestication and animal sentimentality, settlers declared the raccoon to be an ideal household pet because of its charm and ability to live with and adapt to humans. However, the raccoon's comfort around humans and constant push of human-non-human boundaries, for example, opening doors, stealing food, escaping homes, and eluding capture, quickly drove scientists to warn the public that raccoons, and I quote, could never truly be granted their full liberty like other pets such as cats and dogs. Raccoons' unruly intelligence was also the topic of heated debate in American psychology at the turn of the 20th century. Psychologists became interested in studying the learning process in different species by focusing on animal intelligence through laboratory experiments. One group separated human qualities like mental imaginary from animals' intelligence that simply involved, and I quote, the accumulation of specific muscular associations. According to this Cartesian behaviorist interpretation, all animal behavior was purely instinctual, uninformed by reason or learning. A second group of psychologists, however, challenged these views after conducting experiments with raccoons. Recognizing the popularity of raccoons as pets, they introduced them as laboratory animals. Through their experimental studies, these researchers became convinced, and I quote, that raccoons possessed ideas, a form of thinking more analogous to that of humans and other mammals, particularly their sense of curiosity and their capacity to learn through touch. Yet, the raccoon never became a model of intelligence among animal psychologists, not only because it challenged the dominant behaviorist perspectives at the time, but because of its unruly behavior and trickster reputation. Even though those who initially argued for keeping raccoons in laboratories became overwhelmed with the practical challenges that raccoons posed to them. It was difficult to manage and maintain a colony of raccoons. One psychologist explained, and I quote, "The creatures would knock the wood and tear at the wire of their cages, trying to escape, biting him when he tried to contain them." So in the same way that the unruly, troublemaking raccoon resisted the colonial spaces of laboratories and made psychologists uncomfortable, the child care center raccoons produced anxiety and even panic among the humans who shared the space with them. Now, so far I talked about two boundaries, crossing spatially and ontologically. Now the third boundary. The third way that the raccoons cross the human-non-human divide is microbially, by infecting. As pests and trash animals, raccoons are perceived as infectious to humans, especially to children. Educators at the child care complex have been advised by both parents and child care licensing officers. Do you have licensing officers? Right. That not only are raccoons susceptible to carrying rabies, but their feces are infectious. Humans might contract salmonella by touching, ingesting, or inhaling raccoon feces. The educators are particularly worried about raccoon worm. The raccoon is the primary host of an infectious worm that develops in the raccoon intestine, producing millions of eggs that are passed in the animal's feces. The eggs become infectious after 2 to 4 week incubation period, after which they can survive in the environment for a very long time. And humans are infected if they ingest fertile eggs, and because developmental developmental discourses maintain that children frequently put objects, hands, dirt in their mouths, and a lot of other things, children are seen to be particularly at risk of infection. And here is a story. After taking a drink of water in the playground, the mother leads her cubs toward the raccoon latrine, a shaded windowsill out of the view of the playground that the raccoons have selected as their preferred site for their latrine. Her youngsters follow their mother up a tall tree beside the childcare building. As the adult confidently moves from the tree to the windowsill, the cubs watch from a branch as she goes number 2, as the children like to say. She returns to the tree, and the 2 cubs each take their turn. One of the childcare center's managers enters her office and notices a young raccoon on her windowsill. She yells at the animals to go away. The cub stares at her and continues with his business. The manager sighs. Once again, she is unable to open her window for fresh air. She picks up the phone and calls the childcare complex cleaners, who had been there only yesterday to clean up after the raccoons. Infections circulate through transfers, through codings, through opportunistic and occult becomings, making them very difficult to control. So a molecular process of relating between animals and raccoons takes place in these childcare centers, violating established boundaries and reminding the educators of the biological risks of their entanglements, their already entanglements with other species. These trans-infections with infectious and implicated hosts, because we can also say that humans were the first infectious species to come into the forest, if we think that they infected the forest with their presence. These trans-infections provoke us to think about the ethical, political challenges of cohabiting with other species that provoke these awkward encounters, particularly when these infections are anathema to human attempts to hygienically enforce nature-culture separations. With their infectious feces, along with the worry of some parents and educators that raccoons carry rabies, raccoons in the playground unsettle the inherited and normalized understandings of children's spaces as free of bacteria and disease, even though child care centers are never free of bacteria and disease, especially when they are transferred from other species. Sanitation discourses of public health were introduced from Britain to its colonies, including Canada, in the 19th century. Valuing Western medicine, the settlers were concerned about public health and preventing the spread of diseases, including infections, to ensure their own health. The focus was on maintaining the divide between the pure settlers and the wild. These colonial sanitization discourses continue today. They allow the construction of raccoons as unruly and infectious, and justify the colonial projects of hygiene that are instituted in the child care centers. These colonial assumptions about cleanliness, about being safe from the filthy and infectious aspects of nature, shape the practices that we deem so important in child care center pedagogies. Okay, so now I'm going to move to talk about how the educators attempt to maintain the divides that the raccoons cross. Educators feel ambivalent, as I said, about the presence of the raccoons, and especially about the raccoons' insistence on crossing boundaries. They juggle the desire to develop the children's attachments to the raccoon with their duty of care to protect the children from the possible risks that exist when cohabiting with these animals. Mandated by the British Columbia Child Care Licensing Regulations, they conduct regular playground inspections, including raccoon checks, to identify hazards and non-conformances against the playground standards. And if necessary, they make adjustments to meet the mandatory requirements and provide a safe, secure environment for the children. I'm not sure if you do the same thing here in your child care centers. But it's a normal routine that the educators do twice a day. Despite their uneasiness about the raccoons, the educators recognize the value of the children and their own relationship with the raccoons. While raccoons would be exterminated in many child care centers to protect the children, and in these centers, the raccoons are seeking ways to cohabit with raccoons by putting strategies in place to deal with the raccoons' transgressions and mischievous behaviors. Having said that, though, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's not that the raccoons happily live in the child care center. For example, special windows have been installed in each of the classrooms that automatically close when a raccoon touches them from outside. The educators are vigilant not to leave the classroom doors ajar to avoid potential danger. And the children are encouraged to watch the raccoons through the windows and skylights instead of from outdoor spaces. Another story. An educator calls the children to join her in the playground. She has carefully executed a raccoon check and did not find any animals in the playground. However, she warns the children not to go near the shed because the raccoon mother is inside with her babies. The children nod and move on to play. A few minutes later, a child yells, "Raccoon, raccoon, raccoon!" 3 raccoons are climbing down the tree closest to the building. Before they can touch the ground, the educator clusters the children together on the opposite side of the playground, maintaining a safe distance from the raccoon. Panicked, she leads them to the classroom door. But the raccoons reach the door first. It seems too risky now to enter the classroom, so the educator leads the excited and frightened children back to the spot where they first gathered and announces that they will not be able to play or go inside until the raccoons leave the playground. Inside the classroom, another educator is preparing the tables for the children to have lunch. She hears a commotion outside, and when she investigates, she sees the raccoons really close to the classroom door. She runs to close it and ensures that the windows are also sealed. Because the child care centers are adjacent, like I was telling you that there are many child care centers to each other, and the raccoons can easily move from center to center along the fence, this educator calls her colleagues in the adjoining center and warns them that the raccoons might move to their playground. So the educators in that center quickly gather the garden hose in case the raccoons come over the fence and they have to spray them with water to scare them away. The raccoons, though, are still in front of the classroom door, and the children remain huddled together on the opposite side of the playground. Child care centers on Canada's earthquake and tsunami-prone West Coast routinely practice natural disaster response drills. Here, in this mountain forest, the educators have instituted a well-scripted routine to respond to another threat, the perceived risk the raccoons pose. Raccoon drills act as a state of alarm that is raised when the nature-culture divide between civilized humans and wild raccoons is breached. In other words, the raccoons' incursions into human territory are treated as natural disasters. The call of raccoon, 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 and the phone calls to the educators in the adjacent center are signals of imminent catastrophe because raccoons are transgressing the nature-culture boundary. The act of leading the children inside is the way that humans reinstate the boundary. Although we at the centers often think of this and refer to these actions as giving the raccoons a space, we wonder if we are rationalizing our anxiety. Are we pretending altruism as a way to disavow our fears about breaches to the natural order of nature-culture separations? This kind of contemporary moral panic echoes the early colonialists' attempts, which continue today to maintain the space of pure nature separate from culture. Brown, who is a geographer, traced the persistence of human-nature division in colonial constructions of British Columbia's forests by ecologists, by foresters, and by environmentalists, and explored the significance of these boundaries for recent political struggles over forestry and decolonization by First Nations. He writes that the nature-culture divide worked as a purification machine, a place where or through which people became white. Baldwin further argues that the subject position of liberal whiteness is also cultivated in its disaffiliation from and rejection of a mythical form of nature through, for instance, provincial and national parks and mythologies about the wild Canadian North. The raccoon drill response is enmeshed in these inherited colonial attempts to distance settlers from unruly nature. The fear of raccoons attacking the humans is always present at the child care centers, but what makes the educators really anxious is raccoons' infectious feces. Despite the fact that apart from the latrine on the manager's office windowsill, raccoon droppings have rarely been found in the child care complex playgrounds, and additionally that no raccoons have ever transmitted rabies in British Columbia, the educators take very seriously the task of checking for raccoon poo before the children go outside. Another story. An educator dons gloves and enters the playground. She carefully inspects each surface and play structure, then scans the tree one by one. Next, she examines the perimeter of the sandbox, pushing toys aside with her hands. Turning her attention to the sand inside the box, she sifts it with a shovel. Finally, she walks along the fence, moving toys that block her view of the ground. Other ways that humans, but not specifically the educators, establish and police colonial nature boundaries have dire consequences for the raccoons. Destruction and death have always been aspects of the violence of settler colonialism and capitalism, and it is certainly not different for these mountain forest raccoons. Their unruliness comes at a cost. One of the teachers arrives early to the center to prepare the classroom. As she opens the first window blind, she makes a grim discovery. A raccoon corpse lies under the climber. Filled with sadness, the educator opens the classroom door that leads to the playground and sees two more raccoons, lifeless in a tree. She dreads the fact that she will have to let the children know that the entire resident raccoon family is dead. Her first instinct is to call facility services to have the dead raccoons removed. Within minutes, the lifeless bodies are gone and the playground area disinfected. Although the facilities worker tells the educator that she does not know how the raccoons died, she is convinced that they were poisoned. She remembers reading an article that noted that campus facility services would begin a program to maintain the growing and unruly raccoon population. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the last part of the paper. As alarming as these inherited and often deadly containment strategies are, they are insufficient to respond to the complexities of entangled lives in this playground. The raccoons remind us of this as they continue to challenge the human-non-human and nature-culture divides, despite all the tactics that the educators put in place. A couple of months after the deaths of the family of raccoons, a new, much bolder family moved in, one that seemed even more determined to challenge the boundaries. In one instance, the new family confronted an educator who attempted to close the door when the raccoons entered the classroom while the children were indoors having lunch. Interestingly, the dead raccoons are fondly remembered as respectful and knowing their boundaries, whereas the new family is seen to be pushing the luck with their repeated attempts to enter the classroom. These raccoons always find a way to be present, to awe us, to surprise us, to disrupt us, and to trick us. As tricksters, they happily display their charisma and intelligence, throwing us into ambivalence about their unruly behaviors. They constantly find ways to interrupt the routines and movements in the child care centers, making it impossible for us humans to extract ourselves from both the natural world that raccoons belong to and our colonial past and futures that the raccoon materially and discursively inhabit. Their unruly insistence on having a presence in the childcare space might remind us humans that nature is not something we can manage. We are rarely in control of our ecologies. Over and above that lesson, the raccoons teach us that our raccoon child educator common worlds are mutually constituted and our lives are already entangled. It is impossible to enforce the nature, culture, and human non-human divides because these divides that the educators, through childcare discursive practices, attempt to impose are fallacious constructs anyway. Moreover, these are exactly the divides that scholars in the environmental and indigenous humanities want to end, because this delusional separation have led us to the ecological and colonial messes of the Anthropocene. Therefore, in this childcare center, we take these awkward raccoon-child-educator relations that nag at us and disconcert us as both opportunities to challenge the prevailing Western binaries that separate nature from culture and animals from humans, and as a possible opening, without any guarantees, without any final truth, but an opening that might allow a new kind of relational pedagogy that follows affective and ethical logics. What if our pedagogies shift from controlling the divides that the raccoons disrupt toward attending at how we might affect and be affected by these raccoons? What if these awkward multi-species relations that continuously make us ambivalent are precisely what makes pedagogies productive, as they push us into grappling with the trouble of mutual flourishing in messy ecological and colonial spaces? Thank you. I'll leave you with the raccoon. Not sure if you want to use that.
I think I can.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think this is a really, thanks Marek for giving me this impossible task. Because it's really hard to respond to such a rich and sort of varied and sort of multi-dimensional story. I was fascinated. I'm sure people around here were great, really, looking at the images and hearing the words and the stories. It's fascinating. But I am going to try and respond. And I cheated a little bit by reading over the last day your edited book that you did with Africa.
Yes.
On sort of unsettling the colonial spaces. So I sort of, some of this sort of is a bit broader than, but I want to say how this fits in, really. So apologies, I'm not going to shut me up as well. Stop. Okay, just wave and tell me when I've had enough. But I want to, the first thing I want to say really is that what I would say about this paper and the presentation is that it seems to me to be at the cutting edge of what I think is increasingly called Anthropocene education work, that really is trying to challenge the notion that we can separate ourselves from the natural world, and that education systems are tending to be predicated on that type of separation. And so that's to locate it as important as a paper, really. And I think it is to do with the denaturalization of nature. That clear notion that we used to think of nature as being something out there, separate from ourselves, from human nature. And this is sort of now we're imbricated. So that's the sort of the sort of position I would take on this paper and where it fits. But I think so on top of that, in response to this paper, I would sort of raise a number of questions about that project and as it's being developed. And this is for sort of food for thought and discussion in the community. So I've got three things I want to say, three areas I want to just briefly talk about. Animals, space, and childhood education is my sort of point, and I'll trying to link them together. And I want to running through that, are what I would call my 1998 moment, and I'll say why in a moment, and my 2008 moment, and why this matters in terms of thinking about animal space and childhood in relation to this paper. So everything is trying to sort of respond to this agenda, I think. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is why 1998? Well, 1998 for me was a pivotal moment. I was teaching geography and completing a doctoral study, and I came across a book by two geographers called what's the name? It's Welch and Emma. I'm not going on first names. Jodie Emma and Jennifer Welch, called Animal Geographies. I think it had something about the animal-human divide in it. It was a collection of essays, and it was the first time where they were sort of talking about this idea that that human geography and geography as a subject, and I'm a geographer, had excluded the animal animals from its study. Although animals were always there in those charts of how many sheep in New Zealand, where they're located, pastoral divide. And there was a book by Marek Newbig in 1913 called Animal Geography. I would say sort of reference. So geography has always been interested in animals, but always from a human perspective, not animals for their own sake. And what they tried to argue in this book is that we need to take seriously the borderlands, that was the subtitle, the borderlands between animals and nature. Animals and humans. And then 2 years later there was another book called Animal Spaces, Beastly Places by another couple of geographers. And what I think is that, for me, that was quite an exciting time to be a geographer. And it was part of a broader term which was taking place within the social sciences and humanities. And for a while, geographers were trendy and fashionable. They were sort of invited to speak at conferences because space mattered. And what they were doing, geographers, was deconstructing the history of their discipline. They were looking at the exclusions, the various exclusions, which had made the subject a white, male, heterosexual, sort of colonialist project. And there were a whole set I've done them all in my book, and I sort of looked at them. So we had feminist and black geographies, now we have queer geographies, geographies of sexuality, geographies of youth and children, geographies of animals, post-colonial geographies, a whole set of terms were going on, deconstructing the dominant discourses of the discipline. And the key point of all of this was that those things, those categories and those identities that they brought could not be taken as essential, couldn't be seen as commonsensical, they had to be sort of seen as social constructions, and they were always socially and spatially varied and historically located and all of those things which were going on. And that's why it was exciting to be at the time, because there's a lot of deconstruction happening around it. You shut me up. Go on. No, right, okay, no, give me 2 more minutes, okay. So what we had is that geography with a capital G was being replaced by geographies with multiple geographies with a small g. And we told smaller stories. We weren't looking for grand narratives anymore about the history of capitalism and so on. We were looking for micro-narratives. And this was very linked with the post-modern term. And geography was seen as being sort of the old-style geographer, being in the field, mapping and surveying and observing nature and the world, was sort of passé and so on. Now, I don't want to say much more about that, but that's, I think, the story we have to tell, that was happening in that moment. Personally, I think we need to revisit what was happening to the world at that moment, why we were focused so much on difference. But I want to stop and talk a little bit more about space, because this is my key idea. That space and place became terms which became so important, and I sort of was counting, Veronica, the number of times you use spatial metaphors. Entanglements, territorialization, boundaries, borders, crossing, and so on. All these sort of words were sort of floating about. And of course the spatial term was very much rooted. It was in the 1980s that Foucault gave a famous interview where he said, look, the history of the 21st century will be based on geography, not history. And Frederick Jameson said, we are now living in a postmodern hyperspace where we are able to build cognitive maps which help us to understand what we need to do is be able to map and understand the world in that way. Edward Soja, a geographer, talked about the need for the reassertion of space in social theory, that it was time which had hidden things from us, now we looked for space and so on. Space was everywhere. And geographers got involved in quite an important debate at that point about how space should be conceptualized. And one strand of this took a very sort of materialist view and said, look, space is produced. Space is a social construct, it's not natural, in the same way that you were saying here. Those teachers and those children, those raccoons are creating space. But a particular school of geographers said space is actually being produced by dominant forces which are capital. And Henri Lefebvre, Marxist geographer, produced a book called The Production of Space. He said the dominant production societies vary in how they organise their spatial arrangements. In capitalist societies, space is dominated by capitalist relations, power, law, partitioning, and sort of those early ones. Another group of geographers said, well, so that's all very well, but those are two big categories to talk about space. What about the way in which space is resisted from the bottom up? And I was very interested by your use of unruly and trickster, because it reminded me of the work of Michel de Certeau and the practice of everyday life, where almost the animals there would come into people who were turning space into place and meaningful and so on. And so there was this sort of top-down, bottom-up, how is space being produced? And one story said, look, everything is being dominated by capital. And the other said, no, everything is being dominated by sort of resistances. And there's always this to and fro. And I don't think it's been resolved, other than to say that Neil Smith always argues that when people use spatial metaphors, spatial terminology, are they using them metaphorically or materially? And the challenge I would have here is how far in the discourse of childhood education are the use of space are sort of, and I'm not, when I say this, people say, oh, you're just a geographer trying to defend your disciplinary territory. And I sort of go, yeah, okay, maybe I am. But I mean, it's important whether we actually mean real spaces or metaphorical spaces and what they actually work. And I want to sort of end now by saying that really, then in terms of early childhood education, I'm very attuned to go into the new book category, the new book counter in the library. And I'm always taken by the way in which early childhood education is full of books about space. And I just went to the library and picked up a few recent ones. You've got Transforming Education from Real Utopias, it's a spatial term if you like. Live spaces of early childhood, unsettling, you've got that sort of notion. Diverse spaces of early childhood, critical geographies of childhood in early education. We've got all of these things. And there's a focus on deconstructing this notion of childhood, nature, classrooms, pedagogy. And space seems to be moving in a sort of Deleuzian way, from sort of a striating to a smooth space, without sort of recognising sometimes the structural terms which led to, which post-structuralism is a reaction, I feel, in many ways. So I suppose the question I've got really is, what does all this messy space, the local focus, lead to in terms of ways forward, the politics of space, if you like, within that way? And I suppose I'm just going to end it in one way. Going back to my 2008 moment, is that the 2008 reminded us just how important capitalism was, really. And the way in which value in child, part of the worries about space and its contamination here is to do with the value added for these childhood centres as economic units. I don't want to reduce it to all of that, but it's interesting that you use the word settler colonialism as opposed to settler capitalism. Because I think in a place like this, I would argue the people who created the New Zealand space were acting as settler capitalists first. And the colonialists, there's a debate to be had. I know it's an age-old debate, but it's interesting in terms of how we name these. Because you've tried to link the micro to a bigger thing called settler colonialism. And I think that's sort of how you link the local and the global becomes really important. So you can see it was food for thought. Reading your book and listening to you talk has been fantastic. And I think this is a really important debate that geographers. I was very interested, one of my colleagues in here, Sasha Mathinen, is writing about animal spaces and animal geographies and teaching and pedagogies. And it's really worth, I think we should be having this debate as a faculty. And Veronica has given us a great send-off today to get us going on that. But thank you so much, I'll shut up. I don't expect you to respond to any of that, if you don't mind. It was just spouting.
Can we ask some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got two questions for you, Veronica. First one, has a raccoon ever killed someone in the last 50 years, a child or an adult in North America?
Not in British Columbia. They can attack.
Yeah.
They bite, particularly if they have babies and you corner them. But that's what makes them so interesting, right, to work with.
Yes.
They are there. They're not going to go away.
So do you think the fears are justified?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that I'm not trying to say, that the educators should not be scared of the raccoons or the children should not be scared of the raccoons. I would be scared. I wouldn't want to corner a raccoon anywhere. So.
And one quick follow-up question: do you think the raccoons, have they changed at all
Yes, so this work is larger. It's just one part of the work on common worlds pedagogy that we are doing, right? And one of the things that we are trying to avoid is thinking about learning scientifically about the raccoon, even though it's like I read in my paper, there's a lot of science that we learn, but we are trying to avoid the idea of teaching children about the raccoons and thinking about how we are affected and how we affect the raccoons, and thinking with the raccoons. So it has changed. The raccoons had certainly changed a lot of the regulated practices that exist in the child care center. But I also think that the educators and the children have also shifted their perception about how separated or not they are from the raccoons. But it's also because I'm working with the educators. This is not that I just went and collected data, but I'm working with the educators weekly to unpack a lot of these binaries, and we do a lot of geography reading around the nature-culture divide, so they are aware that they're with me in this argument, and not that we have the solution, or I don't know how to respond to it, I don't know, but they are working with me on thinking these ideas with us.
Have children ever touched the raccoons?
No, we haven't.
So do you think that children could? I mean, some animals seem to perceive when a child is younger in the species and seem to treat them in a different way.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be possible?
That it would be possible to catch the raccoon? I don't think that will.
Or the raccoons touch them?
Yeah, the raccoons will enter and touch, because they're interested in humans, right? Like other animals, like bears or deer, they just run away, they walk away. They're not that interested in us, but the raccoons are very interested in us. So the raccoons could. The children want, because the teachers, we do have regulations, and you can't really do that. I don't know, maybe by mistake, if the raccoon appears, they could, I don't know, but so far it hasn't happened. Yes.
Do the teachers' anxieties of the raccoons rub off on the children's perspective of the animal, and does it influence their relationship between the animal and the child?
Say that again?
Does the teachers' anxieties
Yes.
rub off on the children? Because obviously, like, say a child was to enter that centre and hadn't really experienced
children and the educators, that moment was extremely meaningful for them. And they were amazed by that moment. And there are a lot of other animals, right? Like, so it's not just the raccoons. Like, particularly in this mountain forest, there are a lot of brown bears. So the brown bears are always around, and it's a very different kind of relation. It's very localized, and these animals and the children make the space, right?
And there will be stories about raccoons and bears, stories, cultural stories, and stories that children make up.
Yes, yes. Yeah, the creation stories, children's stories, but there are also contemporary perspectives. Raccoons, yes, yeah, and stories about all these animals that they don't look like anything like the animals themselves, right? Like the bears. We have, I don't know if you have them here, but most children's stories about bears are this kind of English stories. Paddington Bear and Winnie the Pooh, that was a Canadian bear that was taken by a soldier to Britain and put in a zoo, and then was the Winnie the Pooh story was created. So there are all this kind of interesting stories about the animals that, to tell you the truth, a lot of the children just connect with those stories, know more about those stories than the bear themselves. Yes.
Have you done any writing or thinking about how your being at the centres has affected relationships?
Has changed the relationship?
Yeah.
Yes, I actually did an article in Canadian Children about children encountering bears, and the bears are not as close as the raccoons. They don't really come to where humans are unless they're eating, and they're usually minding their own business. The only thing that you need to be careful is when they have calves and become too close. But yeah, I've written an article, and I don't know, I don't remember, maybe in the book, in the Unsettling book, in the chapter, was it kangaroos and bears?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay. I forgot.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2, there you go. So there is a little bit in that chapter that we pair kangaroos and bears. So like I'm working with Veronica Taylor and this animal and children.
Yeah, because I've Taylor came from
Yes.
things, and I listened to her, and just here, I'm not sure where I've got this from, but just the idea that you're not the way of being or doing this research is to be open to the relationships coming into their own space, becoming with, rather than pre-identifying or supposing how things should be. And but then of course whether as a researcher, whether you speak or not, you're speaking to the situation. I'm not sure how you deal with that or notice that, because do you think perhaps that people must know what you're working on, and so maybe their relationship, or the teachers, I'm thinking teachers, and maybe a softening towards raccoons and a bit more space for the children to be with raccoons. I don't know if you noticed that or talked about that or thought about that.
Yeah, I think that one methodologically is about who else lives here with us, and how do we pay attention to what else is around us, and rather than always be aware of the children. It's about a lot of things, about decentering the child, that the child, perhaps the child is not the most important thing,
wondering about the politics of that. Have you noticed it affected the kids and the teachers?
Yes.
You have, yeah.
That they change, that
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think part of it is because this you know, in this, I call it an ethnography, but not in this center, but there is another center that I work with, and I was thinking about deer, where I'm actually part of my teaching is actually working in the center with the teachers and the educators.
Yeah.
So as I'm not just collecting data, but I'm doing things with the teachers and the educators to think about the raccoons. You know, I'm giving the educators readings about the separation between nature and culture. So they are very much immersed, and they are as a researcher as I am, and they are trying to shift their perspectives and change their practices. So there are a lot of things. It's not that I just go and observe, but I'm very much involved in thinking together with the children and the educators. So that way, then you see that there are changes, because we're talking about it. We meet every month to talk about this data that we collect, and we've been doing that for 4 years now. So we know each other very well.
I'm interested in the, you mentioned the Indigenous,
Yes.
and you make some sort of intentions perhaps that are possible in New Zealand,
Yes.
which is not Indigenous to New Zealand.
Yes.
It's seen as a foreigner,
Yeah.
an invasive one, a
Yes.
danger to Indigenous species.
Yes.
So we poison it,
Yes.
and you did mention a program of
Yes.
poisoning.
That was.
Is there does the council have a program of poisoning this Indigenous creature? Does it matter if it's Indigenous?
The university does, yes. And so deer, they don't poison deer. Because there are lots.
Population.
Yes, it's not in danger. Like, you know, deer also are everywhere in another university and in another community, a very, very extensive community in Victoria called Oak Bay, where they are in nuisance because they're always there. But that idea of invasive species and native species is very interesting,
It's
right?
brilliant. As is the you mentioned Lebanus and the notion of being younger.
Yes.
So that idea that somewhere there is a policy that says poison. How does that affect the teacher's relationship?
Yes.
Relationship with the different species
Yes.
other than themselves, but in actual fact, it's got death warrant.
Yeah, it's very, very messy, yes. And with one of the, I just started to write a paper with one of my colleagues in North America. This child care center, they brought in, you know, those stick insects? What do you call them? Stick insects. A few years ago, I don't know how they came to the center. Well, I know how. They wanted, you know, children to be part of nature, and the teachers brought these pets into the classroom, and they're reproducing like crazy, and now no one wants to have them, and they are an invasive species, and they cannot put them back they cannot put them in the forest because they will actually destroy the forest. So they have created or they have different strategies, like they will put the eggs in the freezer to freeze the eggs so they don't continue to reproduce. But you know, it's this idea that we can just kill any invasive species. It's like, is there anything that is original anymore? And what is our ethics around that? So I don't know. I'm thinking about that because it really interests me.
Humans are invasive.
Yes.
We are
Yes.
invasive species.
Yeah, so is it okay not to, you know, they feel sad about the raccoon, but what about these stick insects that are in the child care center because we brought them in the first place? So it's very, very messy.
So the strategy is you so much as frighten the possum, you'll be in trouble.
Yeah.
You know that?
If
You're not allowed to hurt them, harm them,
in
frighten them.
Australia.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Because
Yeah,
they're
I
in-
learned that, yes.
So they're
sure if that happens here. Sorry, it happened here in New Zealand, but